Rachel, it's about 1 o'clock, but let's give people a couple minutes to gather round for this talk. How are things where you? Where are you actually?
Things are pretty good. I am currently in Durham in the Research Triangle, North Carolina. Yeah, doing okay. I'm just hanging in there. How about you?
Pretty much the same. I'm probably about what 10 miles away from you in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So it's a pretty beautiful day out there. A little hot. Yep. So
Well, that's awesome. I feel like it's, it feels very much like summer right now with the heat and humidity down here.
yes, I welcome to the South, right? It's like this.
Yes.
This is your first experience living in the South, isn't it?
Yeah, so I grew up in California and in Colorado, so I am not accustomed to humidity whatsoever. And even though this is our second full summer being here, it's still an adjustment.
I think one of my colleagues said you have to be prepared because sometimes in the summer in North Carolina, it feels like stepping out into an armpit. That was
Yeah, I can see
pretty telling.
that. Yep.
But it is amazing when the sky gets this blue. I think the way they got me to move to North Carolina in the first place was they brought me down here on a day where the sky was just Carolina blue. And
Mm,
I was sold. It's a blue that you don't see everywhere, for sure.
yep. Yep. And the thing that surprised me most when we first moved down here was how lush everything is. Like it feels almost like a jungle if you kind of take, an off the beaten path. But it's just beautiful. We never really had anything, or at least I wasn't really exposed to that type of topography in Colorado and California. So
Yeah, early in the spring, I had this fantasy about writing a book called 50 Shades of Green, just talking about all the different greens that North Carolina has in the spring. It's pretty, once you all can travel again, come
yeah.
on down and then you'll be able to see it. I'll give people one more minute and then we'll just dive into our first edgy talk.
Sounds great. Yeah, I know that it can be challenging sometimes to get tech working appropriately, and it just takes a couple minutes to
Exactly.
get settled. So,
Exactly. And for those people who can't join us live, this will also be recorded. And so they'll be able to revisit it at future times.
yes. Yeah, it should be available on all of EDGI's social media platforms, correct?
Right. And pretty uniformly branded. So pretty much if you type in at EDGI, EDGI study, STUDY, you'll find us on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. We're all over the place. So
Awesome. It'll make
right.
it easy to find.
Exactly. All right, let's dive into this.
Sounds good.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Cynthia Bulik. I am the lead principal investigator of the Eating Disorders Genetics Initiative.
Uh-oh. Looks like Cindy may have cut out for just a minute, so bear with us. Gotta love technology, right? All right, so Cindy is going to check her internet connection, but she'll be rejoining us shortly. But yeah, stay tuned. She'll be back on in a few moments, and we'll be sure to talk a little bit about the EDGI study and kind of my own experience in both the research and clinical world, and just lots of different things. So feel free to talk, or feel free to send us questions if you have any for us. Something that I'm particularly passionate about is athlete mental health and athletes with eating disorders. So that will also be something that we'll be sure to touch on. All right, Cindy is joining us again, so we're going to try this one more time.
That was
Welcome back.
one. That was a new one. All right, let's try this one more time. So when did you lose me, out of curiosity?
Right at the beginning.
Excellent.
Yep, so we can start fresh.
All right, well, I can't seem to make anything happen here, so give me 2 seconds
Sure.
so that I can turn off some bells and whistles, and we'll try again, and hopefully Zoom won't crash. So anyhow, welcome to our first EDGI talk. As I was saying before I cut out, I'm so used to going out and giving like formal academic talks about eating disorders. This is just a completely different format. Where we want to tell you about the study, about the Eating Disorders Genetics Initiative. You can read more about that at edgi.org. But here we want to do 2 things. Tell you a little bit about the study, but then in a much more informal way, just talk about topics related to eating disorders that are special and that are important to people. And that we don't often get to talk about in academic scenarios. And at the same time, we're going to invite people in who have specific knowledge or expertise in those areas. You could also nominate topics. You can nominate topics by telling us things you'd like to hear about in an EDGI talk. So hopefully over the next year or so, we'll be able to have several of these EDGI talks and really cover a lot of topics that are of value to anybody who has interest in the eating disorders field. And today, I'm really excited to start off with a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but also near and dear to our guest's heart. And I'm really pleased to welcome Rachael Flatt. And I think we should both sort of acknowledge a conflict of interest before we start. Rachael is also my graduate student, so she couldn't say no to being on this interview today. But her special area, of course, is eating disorders in athletes. But what I'm going to do is hand it over to her and let her introduce herself. Rachael.
Thank you so much. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I am very excited to be able to start these talks. So a little bit about me. Obviously, like Cindy said, I am a graduate student in the clinical psychology department at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm entering my 3rd year, so I'm almost halfway through my program. I'm also involved on a number of the SEED research studies, including EDGI. So I'm very excited about that. But prior to starting graduate school, kind of my prior career was in figure skating. I was a 2010 Winter Olympian in ladies figure skating and national champion. And so now I'm really merging my passions between studying eating disorders and athlete mental health. So I'm just really excited to be here. And, again, just thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Rachael. So let's kick it off. And I'm just going to ask you, what is the nature of your relationship with the eating disorders field? You've told us a little bit, but go in a little bit more depth.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously I'm getting research and clinical training on that right now. But prior to that, I think I was exposed to it quite a bit in the skating world. With it being an aesthetic sport where you're really focused on kind of your physique and how you look and your weight and your shape, unfortunately, eating disorders were pretty common in skating, especially at the top of the sport. And in other sports where there's kind of a similar focus, like diving and gymnastics, and especially where there's a judge component to that, eating disorders tend to be pretty common. So I was exposed to a lot of negative comments about my weight and my shape, from coaches, from fans, from judges, pretty much anyone, you name it. I was told to drop 20 pounds the week before my very first World Championships in Los Angeles. And, at the time I was 16 years old and a very malleable teenager who was about to perform on the world stage for the first time. And hearing that, of course, really negatively impacts, my body image. So fortunately, though, I had tremendous support from my family, and I feel like they were kind of the preventative measure for me. So I didn't go down the path of a full-fledged eating disorder. And instead, I now am able to kind of give back to that community, through research, through clinical work, and also now through the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Mental Health Task Force as an athlete representative, I'm able to give back to those communities and help make those environments safer and just help us understand a little bit more about the disorders. So that's kind of my relationship to eating disorders and athlete mental health.
So just to take a moment, so you're telling me that there's this young female athlete who is like landing all of her triples and doing clean programs left and right, but the feedback you got was that you were the wrong size or the wrong shape? Is that?
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing was at the time that I was kind of at my peak, I was one of the most competitive, US athletes. And it was shocking to me that the comments that I was receiving were mostly geared towards how I looked rather than my actual performance. And I know that that impacted my scores, which was probably the worst part about it. But at the same time, I knew that I wanted to focus on being healthy and strong and fit and being able to perform those skills to the best of my ability, rather than kind of sacrificing my health for the possibility of some very short-lived success, because we do know that eating disorders really negatively impact your performance, both short-term and long-term. And yeah, I just knew that was something that I wanted to prioritize. And thankfully, my parents were really strong advocates in that moment too, because as I said, as a teenager, it's kind of hard to be able to navigate some of those situations. But they were really a grounding force for me on that front.
And bravo to parents. I think that's one of the things that we say a lot in, even the Academy for Eating Disorders 9 Truths. It's like, parents can be your strongest allies. And we talk about it in terms of recovery, but you're talking about it in terms of parents being your allies in terms of prevention, which
Right.
I think is something that's super important as well. I was just going to sort of like dovetail off something that you said, because we think about eating disorders in the aesthetic sports or the sort of the sports that emphasize thinness often. But yesterday I did this fascinating interview with a Canadian ice hockey player. And you and I have spent enough time in skating rinks to know that hockey isn't one of your typical aesthetic sports, right?
Right.
Covered with all this protective gear. And she developed serious anorexia nervosa. So it's not just that focus on thinness and appearance, but one of the things that we talked about yesterday was that some of those personality characteristics that make you a great athlete, like being really determined and being dogged and being perfectionistic and having high pain tolerance, those are also some of the things that can put you at risk for developing an eating disorder. And it's just sort of what way they're channeled. If they're channeled pathologically, you can go down that path of an eating disorder. But if we can channel them in a healthy direction, then they can really support you in excelling in your sport.
Absolutely. You're completely correct. And I think reflecting on a lot of my peers who wound up having eating disorders, a lot of those characteristics, were very clear. And at the same time, I think those were characteristics and still are characteristics in me. And I've learned to kind of channel those into healthier things, and in terms of kind of building out my, my research and clinical career, and, kind of focusing those characteristics towards that rather than focusing on my eating and my weight and shape.
Right. You were lucky in a sense that you had parents who were so supportive. I just wonder if you have any sort of wise words for athletes really of any age who, right now might be dealing with some of those negative comments, or might be having body image issues, or maybe, as you said, having gone down the path of a full-fledged eating disorder. Do you have any words of wisdom about what you would recommend that they do?
Yeah, I mean, two things really come to mind. The first is, if you feel like you're struggling, please reach out to, a trusted adult, or, peer, or someone who is in a position to help you. That could be a parent, that could be a coach, someone who in your life is, really a strong advocate for you. And don't be afraid to share that, you're struggling. Opening that door for that discussion can be a huge challenge. But once it's open, then there are opportunities to help get you the resources and the treatment and the prevention materials that you need. The other piece is, if you start getting comments from folks, who are talking about your weight and your shape or your eating habits, or whatever might feel troublesome to you, don't be afraid to say, hey, that comment really didn't sit well with me, or that didn't feel appropriate, and be okay with either walking away from that conversation, or, being able to process that with someone else who, can support you better in navigating that. I think that was something, looking back on my career, that I wish I had maybe been able to implement a little bit more. I think in a lot of cases, I felt like I was in a position of kind of weakness or inferiority compared to the other person. There was some sort of power dynamic. But in fact, I really was in power in those situations. It was just my perception of that. And being able to, say, okay, you know what, that's not helpful to me to hear right now. I need to walk away from this. That's something that's really powerful and empowering. And, I really hope that others can feel the confidence to, to say those things and do those things down the line, especially if you're receiving, if you're on the receiving end of those kinds of hurtful comments.
I think that's really good advice. And I think for someone who's maybe a little bit older, it's easy to do that. But, I think about a 12, 13, 14-year-old girl or boy, with the brain of a young adolescent, it's sort of hard to feel that empowered. So I think your advice to get a parent on board or an adult on board to help you do that is really great too. And also the message that, reaching out for help isn't a sign of weakness.
Right.
If anything, it's sort of a sign of courage and strength. So that's another important message I think we need to get across to young athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to add to that too, within sports, we are so there's this kind of thought that's ingrained in us, where if you say you're struggling, or if you feel like you're weak, or there's some perception of weakness, that just isn't really the case in this scenario. It's like, if you are able to ask for help and get, the resources that you need, like you said, that is such an empowering and courageous thing to do. And I think, again, it's not weakness in those moments. It really is strength.
Yeah. All right, let's pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about the genetics research we're doing, because we've sort of been talking about the influence of sport and focus on appearance on eating disorders. But
Right.
A lot of the work that we do here at the UNC Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders, and what EDGI is all about really, is looking at how both genes and environment influence risk for eating disorders, and not just anorexia nervosa, but anorexia, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder.
Right.
And a study we just finished called ANGI, or the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative, first off, it told us that genes play a role. So we need to pay attention to genetic factors and understanding what causes eating disorders now. But second, it told us that not only is part of the genetic component for anorexia related to sort of psychiatric or psychological factors, but there's another part of it that is genetically related to metabolic factors. And to us, that was sort of really amazing, because one of the things that's super hard to understand about anorexia is how people can drop weight so fast and so far and keep that weight off, and why it's so hard to re-nourish people. It's almost like their bodies, even if we refeed them in the hospital, it's like their bodies pull them back down to that low body mass index. So hearing that there's like a genetic metabolic component to this sort of really made me sort of redefine how I think about eating disorders. And I'm just wondering, when you heard the results of ANGI, that, we called it a metabopsychiatric illness, which is a new label, how did that influence your narrative about what causes eating disorders?
Yeah, I mean, personally, it made so much sense based on what we know about the presentation of the illness. I also, kind of stepping back a little bit, for me personally, there's so much debate about the genetic piece of psychiatric disorders anyways. And, I was a biology major in undergrad, and both my parents have a really strong background in biology. My mom's a molecular biologist, and my dad's a biochemical engineer, who has worked on genetics. And it was shocking to me that, kind of in growing up with them, and also in, high level, bio courses, we never really even talked about the fact that genetics can impact psychiatric disorders. And of course, I was like, well, of course that makes sense. Of course, this is just, how could we not have covered it up until this point? But I think there were a lot of factors kind of preventing that, and there really wasn't a lot of research out there. And now with those, with the kind of landmark EDGI study, we really have so much more support for that narrative and that understanding of anorexia nervosa. And so for me, I feel like that has really changed how we're conceptualizing the disorder. And I think will also help us understand how to better treat these folks who have been dealing with this illness for quite some time, or, have just had a newly onset illness. So for me, I think this could be a total game changer. And this is also what makes me very excited about EDGI and, the prospects and the potential for this study.
Yeah, no, obviously, I totally agree. And, for people who do want to read more about these findings, you can go up to the EDGI website, which is edgi.org. And one of the things that we're going to try to do in our social media feed is really continue to educate people about this. And that is, as we said before, at EDGI Study on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And we're going to try to post, different sort of blog posts and just little news blurbs that try to take some of this genetic information and the research that we're generating and sort of distill it down, in bites that people can actually chew.
Right.
Because I think sometimes when you go to the primary literature and try to read that stuff, your head just explodes. And that's really not what it's for. That literature is for people who are, genetic nerds and like reading that kind of stuff. And exactly. Rachael Flatt, proving that you can be both an athlete and a nerd. I love it.
Guilty as charged.
Exactly. But, and that's something that, I think that's our job. And, Rachael, hopefully you'll do some of that through your career too, is just changing the way the world thinks about these illnesses, because they have been misunderstood for so long.
Absolutely.
And it's our job to really say, hey, wait a minute. Actually, it reminds me of what you just said, how you wished when you were younger, you had been able to say something like, hey, that's not really helpful for me to hear right now. We can do the same thing if we have someone say something just off the wall or flat wrong about eating disorders. We can say, hey, let me tell you about this new research I heard about, sort of like not being judgmental, but just clearly replacing that wrong information with current and correct information.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, there's something to be said about having these types of discussions. And at the same time, like our job, this is obviously something that I'm still in the process of learning because I'm still in graduate school. But, as we kind of navigate the research field, like we obviously want to do research that is meaningful and clinically impactful, and disseminating that information to the folks that are practitioners of those things. But at the same time, or I should say, and at the same time, we want to make sure that kind of the laymen and women, I should say, really understand what this means and how this might impact their life. And, for if they themselves are experiencing an eating disorder, or someone in their family or friend, it's really helpful for them to understand a little bit more of that information. So, being able to have discussions like this with you right now and being able to convey this information in, outside of a journal article and outside of a research conference is so important.
So let's say there's someone out there watching who has or has had at any time in their life, because your genes don't change, right?
Yep.
So if someone had bulimia 20 years ago, we're still inviting them to participate in the EDGI study. Let's say there's someone out there who has had an eating disorder, is thinking about participating in EDGI. What would you say to invite them into the study, and what's it all about?
I would say, please do so. For us, obviously, we're both a little bit biased and really excited about this project, but, this really has the opportunity to be a game changer, just like EDGI was for anorexia nervosa, now for other eating disorders. The participation in the study is very straightforward and pretty low in terms of time commitment. It's just taking a saliva swab and answering a few questionnaires. And like you said, we're looking for folks who have a history of eating disorders or, current eating disorder. And again, especially with kind of all that's going on in the world right now, we also really want to make sure that kind of the sample that we're getting is really representative of any individual who has an eating disorder, and kind of that entire population as well. So, if you do have questions or concerns, you can always reach out to us through our email, or through our social media pages. But we really, really, for me personally, I think if you just have a couple extra minutes and you're willing to participate, please do, because I think this is just a phenomenal study, and I'm, again, super excited about it. I just can't stop saying that.
Let's dive into your diversity comment, because
Yes.
I think that is another, there are so many myths about eating disorders that we need to bust, right? So we may as well, that's not our topic for today, but let's bust it right here and right now. So, there is this completely false history of thinking that there's a certain type of person who develops an eating disorder. In fact, just today I was reviewing some copy for some study, and all of the pictures were the same. They were like white, thin, attractive, blonde people. And I was like, what is this? It's like eating disorders don't care what you look like. They don't care what size or shape you are. They don't care what color your skin is. They don't care what gender you are. Can we please stop portraying them as only affecting a very certain, slice of the population?
Right.
And the data are really clear, especially when we look at like bulimia and binge eating disorder and binge eating behaviors. Sometimes we even see higher rates of those behaviors in African American populations and in Latino populations. So, I think it's another thing that one of the things that I always say is like, it is so much harder to get someone to unlearn something than to get someone to learn something new. And we've got this horrible task of having to get people to unlearn all of these years of false information. But diversity is one of the ones that's at the top of the list, because that's just been so detrimental, because people aren't being detected and aren't being treated who deserve to be detected and treated.
Absolutely. And to build off of that point too, I think there was just a recent study that just came out, that basically said folks, who have an eating disorder and are of color, are 1 to 2 times less likely to receive any sort of care for an eating disorder. And I think, gosh, again, that just fills right, or that, kind of folds right into what you were just saying. If they don't understand or recognize that, that this is something that they may be experiencing, or think, because of my race or ethnicity or gender or, whatever that may be, just because I identify as one of these things doesn't mean that you're any less at risk of having an eating disorder. So I think for me personally, and just, as we kind of move through both this time in our communities and in our society, and also as we, really enhance and improve research studies, now is the perfect time to make sure that we're really truly getting accurately, diverse and representative study samples. So, it's just, again, we all have a lot of work to do on this. And I think, to your point, again, about making sure that we're going to have to disseminate this information to help people unlearn some of these really, these points that have really been hammered home for quite a long time. But, I'm excited to do that work. I think this is such a tremendous opportunity for us.
And I think on the other side, we also want to invite and encourage young people who are thinking about what they want to do for a career, who come from various backgrounds. We need to diversify our workforce as well. So we absolutely invite people of color and men and women and people of all genders, to talk to us about, how do I get into this field? How can I do more work on this? Because it's not just the people who have the illness, but it's the people who study the illness and treat the illness. We need diversity across the board.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that will help us understand kind of the context and the narratives of these disorders. And we really need those diverse perspectives. And for me, I learn the most when I'm talking to someone who is the complete opposite of me in every way, shape, and form. And so, I think we need to really make sure that that is a priority as we move forward. And for me, I've been working on goals over the past couple of weeks, thinking about, how I can translate this into every aspect of my life, but particularly in the research realm, which is, notoriously white, and, we're two white women talking about this right now.
Yep.
So, this is something that we really need to focus on.
Well, thanks for walking down this path with me. And I'm going to pull it back around to athletes, since that was where we started today, and just wondered if there's anything else that you wanted to add on the topic of athletes and eating disorders.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I will kind of touch on, because this is something that we do talk about a lot in our research, is that there really is this misconception about not only eating disorders, but other psychiatric disorders, that, that it is a decision to engage in some of these behaviors and thoughts, whether it's restricting your eating or engaging in harmful eating patterns, or, even seeing yourself as quite overweight when in fact you're severely underweight. A lot of folks see those as decisions, but we know from kind of the mounting evidence about the genetic and biological components of these disorders that it really is a combination of the bio and environmental pieces. And so, while there may be some room to kind of change some of the things about your environment, your biology, for the most part, that's part of who you are. And, that is core to your being. And so I hope that, kind of armed with that knowledge, some people can kind of lift some of the burden that they feel, with regards to the disorder, whether it is your family or yourself or your friends or, whoever that may be. But I hope that with that knowledge, we can kind of alleviate some of that burden that they might feel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that perspective. I think it's incredibly valuable, and thank you for agreeing to be our first guest on our EDGI Talks. And I'll just close by inviting everybody to go up to edgi.org to learn more about the study, and please follow us. Follow us on @EDGIstudy, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Let your friends know about it. If you know someone, or if you yourself have had an eating disorder, please consider whether EDGI would be a good fit for you. And if you have questions, fling us an email. There's always someone on the other end of the email ready to answer your questions. And stay tuned for the next EDGI Talk. We'll be letting you know. We'll announce over social media when the next talk is and who the next guest is. And please feel free to suggest topics. And I think the last thing I'd like to say is, especially if you're in the United States, we've got a holiday coming up this weekend. So I encourage you all to stay safe and to keep your distance. And just remember that wearing a mask is really a sign of caring for other people, respecting other people, and understanding that it's a public health and not a political decision. So thank you so much for joining us on the EDGI Talk today. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.